Hi, folks. So, today we'll be talking about the trait approach, the theory, application, and assessment. So far in our personality series, we have covered what is personality, the research methods that are used to help assess personality, as well as the classical Freudian and neo Freudian lenses through which we can understand and study personality. Today, we'll be moving to the next lens through which one understands personality, and that is the trait approach. So, the outline for today's presentation is we will be talking about what is the trait approach. We will highlight the important trait theorists. We will do a factor analysis and the search for structure of personality. We will be talking about those components of the trait approach. Um, we'll talk about the situation versus trait controversy, the application of the Big Five in the workplace, the assessments of self report inventories, and finally, we'll end the presentation with strengths and criticisms of the trait approach, followed by summary slides that you're more than welcome to read. So, what is the trait approach? Before we can answer that question, we have to basically understand what is a trait. Traits are aspects of personality that are relatively stable over time and differ across individuals. For example, some people are outgoing whereas others are not. So, traits are basically these stable personality dimensions that are relatively consistent over situations and that influence behavior. Traits are different from states because states are more transitory dispositions compared to traits. So when you see the word trait, it categorizes people according to degree to which they manifest a particular characteristic. So something that is particular about someone that is consistent over time and influences behavior. Trait approach identifies personality characteristics that can be represented along a continuum. And it's based on the assumption that personality characteristics are relatively stable over time and across situations. And so the whole point of this approach is to understand personality through these common recurring traits across people. This is a nice diagram which explains the trait continuum. So as you can see, it's a bell curve, right? So you have a lot of people with that trait as the average, usually a trait that a person has, let's say extroversion. So number of people with extroversion trait are usually the average. This is the average, let's say. Then there will be some people who will be low in the trait and some people who will be higher. So a trait continuum always manifests in this kind of depiction. The first trait theorist we'll talk about is Gordon Alport. Now, Gordon Alport was a pioneer in formulating the trait approach, and we will also be talking about other pioneers today. So, Gordon Alport was born in Montezuma, Indiana, to a family with three older brothers, including his 7-year-old Floyd brother. Even as a child, Gordon did not fit in. He said, "I was quick with words, poor at games. When I was 10, a schoolmate said of me, 'Aw, that guy swallowed a dictionary.'" Alport was persuaded by his brother Floyd to attend Harvard. After he got his BSc, he went to meet Freud to chat about psychology. Just imagine how easy it must have been to meet Freud back then. So, after he went to meet Freud to chat about psychology, he spent much time with Freud, and he discovered that Freud spent a lot of time inquiring about Alport's unconscious motifs. As far as Alport was concerned, there were obvious conscious reasons for his behavior. But Freud's limited orientation wouldn't allow him to see the obvious. Psychologists would do well, Alport concluded from the visit, to give full recognition to manifest motifs before probing the unconscious. Alport also believed that our traits have physical components in our nervous systems and predicted that scientists would one day develop technology advanced enough to identify personality traits by examining neurological structures. So, what was Gordon Alport most famous for? First of all, his published work that came out in 1921 called Personality Traits, Their Classification and Measurement was the first recognized work on traits by a psychologist ever. He was also the first person to teach personality as a course in the United States in 1925. He also acknowledged the limitation of the trait concept, saying that behavior is influenced by a variety of environmental factors. So, regardless of what consistent particular pattern you show, the environment also influences this. He also shared that traits have physical components in the nervous system, as I just iterated, and he promoted the concept of self, which is a self that constitutes of these certain traits. So, in Alport's work, he identified two general strategies that researchers might use when they investigate personality, and he called these the nomothetic approach and the idiographic approach. The nomothetic approach is when people can be described along a single dimension according to their level of, let's say, assertiveness or anxiety. In short, nomothetic approach basically refers to the common traits that people have, and it applies to everyone. Whereas idiographic approach, if you heard the word idiographic, it's similar with the word idiosyncratic, or something that is very particular to someone. So the idiographic approach identifies the combination of traits that best account for the personality of a individual. He shared that under the idiographic approach, there are central traits that describe an individual's personality, and there are also cardinal traits, which are the single dominating traits in personality that completely take over the whole personality. You could call it Machiavellian, Homeric, or the John Juans. The advantage of Alport's approaches was that person determines what traits to examine. So the advantage of this idiographic approach, it's central to the person and their particular traits. Now, the next personality trait theorist we're going to talk about is Henry Murray. Henry Murray was quite an extravagant human being. He earned his bachelor's degree in history in 1915, followed by a medical degree from Columbia in 1919. He went to Cambridge University, England, where he earned a doctorate in biochemistry in 1927. During the latter years of his academic training, Murray was exposed to and enthusiastically embraced the writings of Carl Jung. He was particularly impressed with Jung's description of psychological types. In 1925, while studying in England, he arranged to meet with Jung in Vienna. His conversations with Jung persuaded Murray that his real interests were in the budding field of psychology. He had a huge hand in developing the TAT, if you've heard of it, is the thematic apperception test, which is a projective test that shows a bunch of pictures, kind of like story images, to people and asks them to create a story out of this picture, or tell them what's going on in the picture as a way to understand the inner workings of their mind. So, after working at the Harvard Psychological Clinic and receiving formal psychoanalytic training, Murray accepted a position at Harvard, where he taught until his retirement in 1962. Murray took a brief break from academia in 1943 when he was recruited by the Office of Strategic Services, a forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. His job was to use his knowledge of personality to help in the selection of undercover agents. Murray called his approach personology, and identified psychogenic needs as the basic element of personality. He described these needs as a readiness to respond in a certain way under certain given conditions. He eventually arrived at a list of 27 psychogenic needs, including the need for autonomy, the need for achievement, the need for dominance, and the need for order. In keeping with his psychoanalytic background, Murray postulated that these needs are largely unconscious. So, just as we talked about how Jung's psychology was called analytic psychology, Adler's psychology was called individual psychology, and so on and so forth, Henry Murray called his theories, his propositions were organized under the umbrella term he decided to call personology. And personology is a combination of both psychoanalytic as well as trait concepts. And the basic crux is that it consists of psychogenic needs, which are the basic elements of personality. He was very enthusiastic about these psychogenic needs and sort of deconstructing what these were. And he shared that the readiness to respond in a certain way under certain given conditions is what defines a psychogenic need. So, to share more, Murray stated that people can be described in terms of a personal hierarchy of needs. Murray recognized that whether a need is activated depends on the situation, which he called the press. For example, your need for order won't affect your behavior without an appropriate press, such as a messy room. So a press, in short, is a situation that influences the activation of a need. So let's say you need affection, you need attention. And a press is basically an environmental situation, such as you being in an environment where you feel isolated. So your need to feel, to want attention, to want affection heightens in this situation. So presses are sort of the foundation of psychogenic needs, or the foundational influencing factors that impact psychogenic needs. His principal contributions to personality were the thematic apperception test and stimulated extensive research on psychogenic needs. The next theorist we'll discuss is Raymond Cattell. Now, Raymond Cattell was known for factor analysis and the search for the structure of personality. Now, as we get closer to the theorists we'll be talking about and to the present day and age, we will see how the Big Five theory of personality, which is the gold standard way of understanding personality, came to be. So, one of the famous predecessors of this was Raymond Cattell. Factor analysis is a technique employed by Raymond Cattell to determine the structure of human personality. But before I explain to you what factor analysis is, let's kind of deconstruct what Raymond Cattell is all about. So, Cattell was from England. He won a scholarship to the University of London, the only member of his family to ever attend college. In London, Cattell and psychology, the field of psychology, stumbled into a fortunate association. Cattell was hired as a research assistant for the famous psychologist and mathematician Charles Spearman. If you've heard of Spearman correlations, this name will remind you of it. So Charles Spearman, who was studying the relationship between measures of intelligence, he associated with Cattell. Spearman found evidence for a single general concept of intelligence as compared to models arguing for many unrelated aptitudes. In the course of this research, Spearman developed the statistical procedure known as factor analysis. Cattell would later use factor analysis to understand the structure of personality. And so, Cattell was influenced by Spearman, and he was very interested in this methodology called factor analysis. After 5 years working at various clinics in England, Cattell was tempted to come to the United States by an offer to work with the learning theorist E. L. Thorndike at Columbia University. He also worked at Clark University until Gordon Alport invited him to join the faculty at Harvard in 1941. It was at Harvard while working alongside Alport and Henry Murray. Notice how Cattell has worked with both the previous theorists we had highlighted earlier, both Gordon Alport as well as Henry Murray. Under their mentorship, Cattell developed the idea that factor analysis could be a useful tool for personality researchers. He put his insight into practice after joining the faculty at the University of Illinois in 1945, where he spent most of his career. So how does factor analysis work? Look at these two groups, okay? There are a bunch of words and a bunch of words. Do not see the first part, which is group A, group B. Just simply see these words as a random list of words, random list of traits. So, suppose you had tests to measure the following 10 traits: aspiration, compassion, cooperativeness, kindliness, persistence, productivity, and tenderness. You could give these tests to a group of people and obtain 10 scores per person. You might then use correlation coefficients to examine how scores on one test compare with scores on the other 9 tests. For example, you might find that friendliness and tenderness scores are highly correlated. If a person scores high on one test, you can predict with some confidence that the person also will score high on the other test. Looking at the pattern of correlation coefficients, you might discover that the tests tend to cluster into two groups. So, what he basically did was, let's say all of these traits are individual tests on their own, and they're given to participants. So one person takes 10 tests, and then these tests are correlated with each other. What he found was basically that some of these traits were more closely related to other traits than the ones that from the other tests. And he saw that they could neatly be organized into two groups. So aspiration, determination, endurance, persistence, productivity, all of these could be called a group A. And then compassion, cooperativeness, friendliness, kindliness, all of these could be called group B. And so you could say group A could be achievement, the trait of achievement orientation. And group B could be interpersonal warmth, right? So you could label them like that. So although you originally measured 10 traits, a reasonable conclusion would be that you actually measured two larger personality dimensions. One having to do with achievement and the other with interpersonal warmth. This is a simple illustration of Cattell's basic approach. By analyzing data from various sources with factor analyses, he attempted to determine how many of these basic elements exist. He called the basic traits that make up the human personality source traits. Cattell collected information about personality from many different sources. In addition to data from personality tests, he examined personal records, such as report cards, rating by employers, and looked at how people acted when placed in lifelike situations. From this work, Cattell identified 16 basic traits and created a personality test, the 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire. If any of you have heard of this or taken this questionnaire before, you will be familiar with what I'm talking about. So the source traits are basic traits that make up the human personality, and according to Cattell, there were 16 of these. Although the limitation of this approach was that the procedure is confined by the type of data chosen for analysis. What this means is that they would be confined to just these words that the researcher initially picked. It does not saturate the whole list of words that are out there. The next person we'll talk about is Donald Fisk. Now, Donald Fisk, you can say, is a very important predecessor. His work predecesses the Big Five very, very closely. In the summer of 1947, Fisk and his colleagues conducted extensive personality assessments of 128 men who had been admitted into the Veterans Administration's clinical psychology training program. In addition to many standard trait measures, the assessment included projective tests, biographical data, interviews, and ratings from peers. When the researchers factor analyzed all these data, they identified 5 basic personality factors. So these were the 5 basic personality factors: social adaptability, such as talkativeness makes good company. Can you guess which one this hints at? Social adaptability. You could say extroversion. The second was emotional control, which is about having the capacity to get easily upset, sustaining anxieties. And so emotional control is similar to the idea of our current Big Five trait of neuroticism. Then we go to conformity. Now, conformity is the ability to readily cooperate, to be conscientious. And so this goes along the other Big Five, which is conscientiousness. The fourth one is inquiring intellect. It refers to intellectual curiosity and exploring mind, and it refers to the idea of openness under the Big Five. And last but not the least, we have confident self-expression, which is being cheerful, enthusiastic, not selfish, and this goes along the Big Five traits, which are enthusiasm. So, although the data were not quite as clean as these labels suggest, as we will see, the findings foreshadowed the direction personality research would take decades later. The 5 factors shown up in so many studies using a variety of methods that researchers now refer to them as the Big Five. This is the Big Five personality factors table. You will see neuroticism, which is the characteristics include worried versus calm, insecure versus secure, self-pitying versus self-satisfied. So the higher you are on neuroticism, the higher you are on the former traits than the latter ones. Extroversion is sociable versus retiring, fun-loving versus sober, affectionate versus reserved. Openness is imaginative versus down-to-earth, preference for variety versus preference for routine, independent versus conformity. Agreeableness includes soft-hearted versus ruthlessness, trusting versus suspicious, helpful versus uncooperative. And conscientiousness consists of well-organized versus disorganized state of mind, careful versus careless, self-disciplined versus weak-willed. So in short, you could remember these traits with the OCEAN acronym: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. So let's look at each one more carefully. What is openness? Openness is a measure of interest in art and literature and other areas of this sort. Open people are sensitive to aesthetic emotions, to beauty. They have revolutionary ideas. They don't like being at the bottom of the hierarchy or doing rote things. They always strive for variety, for new adventures. People who are high on openness but low on conscientiousness are usually underachievers. Now, openness can further be divided into 2 sub-factors, which is openness and intellect. Openness, as we shared, is creativity. Too much of it can become you can make one impractical, flighty, too idealistic. Liberals are usually known to be higher on openness than conservatives, and women are also tend to be higher in this trait. On the other hand, intellect is an interest in ideas and abstract concepts. Liberals are higher in intellect, men are higher in intellect than women. So, openness involves active imagination, divergent thinking, and intellectual curiosity. People on the high end are unconventional and independent thinkers. Individuals on the low end prefer the familiar rather than imaginative. We will look at the gender differences on the other traits as well, but just to give you a quick snapshot between the genders of men and women, research has found that men are higher in three traits: intellect, industriousness, and assertiveness, while women are higher on all the others. Next, we'll look at conscientiousness. So, conscientiousness is a measure of obligation, attention to detail, hardworking ability, persistence, adherence to rules, efficiency. People high on conscientiousness are usually politically conservative. They feel guilty when they fail. They tend towards being more judgmental. They're very achievement oriented, like managers, admins, and women tend to be more on conscientiousness than men. Conscientiousness is also divided further into two sub-factors, which is industriousness and orderliness. Industriousness has got to do more with dutifulness. Both liberals and conservatives are equally industrious. Men are slightly higher in industrious than women. On the other hand, orderliness is where there is a capacity to keep everything tidy and organized. Conservatives are more orderly than non-conservatives. Women are higher on this than men. So people on the high end are organized, plan-oriented, and determined. Individuals on the low end are careless, easily distracted from tasks, and undependable. Conscientiousness refers as a will to achieve or simply work. Next, we'll look at extroversion. Extroversion is a measure of general sensitivity to positive emotions, such as joy, love, hope, approach in social situations, and it can be divided into enthusiasm and assertiveness. People who are high on extroversion are usually more enthusiastic, talkative, assertive, gregarious. They like to be the center of the party, they're self-disclosing, and women are slightly more on extroversion than men. When you divide extroversion into further sub-factors, which are enthusiasm and assertiveness, enthusiasm means being commonly excitable. Both liberals and conservatives are not really associated with this trait on a significant level, although women are higher on enthusiasm than men. On the assertive side of things, assertive means taking charge, and men are found to be slightly more on this trait than women. So extroversion places extreme extroverts at one end and extreme introverts at the other. Extroverts are very sociable people. Introverts are reserved and independent people. We'll look at agreeableness now. Agreeableness is a measure of nice, cooperative, warm, considerate, nurturing, kind, naively trusting versus stubborn, dominant, harsh. This is what agreeableness entails. And it can further be divided into compassion and politeness. Now, people who are high on agreeableness are enthusiastic, talkative, assertive, gregarious. They also like to be center of the party. They're self-disclosing. And women are slightly more than men. Compassion under agreeableness is an interest in problems of others, kindness and sympathy. Liberals are higher on compassion and women are higher on compassion. On the other hand, politeness, which is this other sub-factor of agreeableness, entails being respectful and uncomfortable to stand up because you have a need to be polite. And liberals are less so on this trait. women are higher in agreeableness. So people with high scores are helpful, trusting, and sympathetic. Individuals with low scores tend to be antagonistic and skeptical. The last big five trait we'll look at is neuroticism. Now, neuroticism is a measure of general sensitivity to negative emotions like sadness, pain, anger, irritability. Highly neurotic people are not really risk takers. They do not associate with political views, and women tend to be higher on this trait. Neuroticism can be further divided into sub-factors, which are withdrawal and volatility. Withdrawal is when the person suffers from anticipatory anxiety and they withdraw. And so liberals are slightly higher on this, women are higher on this trait of withdrawalness. And then the next is volatility, where it's stable and predictable in your moods. Political association is not as strong with this trait. Women tend to be higher on volatility. So when we look at neuroticism, we see that places people according to their emotional stability and personal adjustment. People with high scores are more vulnerable to anxiety and depression, and individuals with low scores tend to be calm and well adjusted. Next, we will be looking at the ongoing questions regarding the Big Five. There's a lot of debate about what the Big Five factors mean, a disagreement about the structure of the Big Five. Researchers have looked into the stability of the Big Five factors over time, then to use stories from Big Five measures versus scores from specific trait scales. Although personality in reality has different structures, our ability to describe personality traits is limited to the adjectives available to us, which may fall into five primary categories. It may also be the case that our cognitive ability to organize information about ourselves and others is limited to these five dimensions. Some factor analytic studies find patterns that do not fit well with the five-factor structure. Researchers have on occasion found evidence for 7, 3, 2, and even one basic factor. These maverick traits include religiousness, youthfulness, frugality, humor, uncanny, special, immoral. The answer appears to be yes and no. Researchers who follow individuals over long periods of time generally find that our personalities become fairly stable during our 20s and show little sign of change after the age of 30. That is, how you score on measures of the Big Five personality dimension during your early adulthood is likely to be quite similar to how you will score on those same measures 20, 30, 40 years from now. So the debate, the disagreement, and the examination by researchers into the Big Five is ongoing. However, in this day and age, on this very day, the Big Five is the strongest gold standard way of understanding and organizing personality into a hierarchical structure. So what are some criticisms of the trait approach? Trait measures do not predict behavior well because both the person and the situation are related to behavior. The person by situation approach basically states that individual traits as well as situations both determine behavior. There is little evidence for cross-situational consistency. So despite of what traits one might inhabit, these are always under the influence of environmental factors, and this is one of the criticisms of the trait approach. So in defense of the personality traits, strong links have been found between traits and behavior, but it's not as established because researchers don't measure behavior correctly. Single traits can predict a person's behavior if that trait is important or central. For the person, inclusion of secondary traits dilutes the correlation between the trait score and the behavior. So, behavior and traits are so complex that considering the complexity of these factors that influence behavior, The ability to explain 10% of variance should be considered good enough between the traits and following behaviors. So let's look at the application value of the Big Five. Let's talk about the context of the workplace. Today, employers use scores from personality tests to make hiring and promotion decisions. Critics complain that employers misinterpret test scores when making these decisions. However, it's still happening. Research provides stronger evidence for the relationship between personality and job performance. Research also indicates that conscientiousness may be the best predictor of job performance. That is, highly conscientious people are organized, hardworking, persistent, and achievement-oriented. People high in agreeableness are trusting, cooperative, and helpful, and work well in team jobs. Extroverts have an edge in the business world over introverts because they can be innovative, they can be more gregarious, outspoken. Test scores of applicants on the Big Five personality dimensions are useful when making a hiring decision. The other practical value is self-report inventory, asking people to respond to a series of questions about themselves. It is a widely used form of personality assessment, has great face validity. It's used by researchers, personal managers, and clinical psychologists. If you've heard of this, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or the MMPI, is the gold standard assessment of personality. It is a prototypic self-report inventory used by clinical psychologists. The revised version was published in 1982, which is known as the MMPI-2. It's a widely used clinical assessment tool. Psychologists also debate the validity of the scales. This is how the MMPI looks like for one person. It contains a total of 567 true-false items, and the revised version has 338 items in total. These items generate several scale scores that are combined to form an overall profile of the test taker. The original scales were designed to measure psychological disorders. Thus, psychologists obtain scores for such dimensions as depression, hysteria, paranoia, and schizophrenia. However, most scores rather than one specific scale when making their assessment. Of particular interest are scores that are significantly higher or lower than those obtained by most test takers. Okay, so this is a pattern of how it looks like. You could see the different labels up here: hyperactivity, and you will see this line for one person's profile. Where is it placed? Higher up, down, how far is this placed? Does it overtake these bars? It's a very interesting test, and it takes hours to get trained on how to administer this test. So if you're interested, I highly recommend looking into it. So the other thing we're discussing are, even though self-report inventories are helpful, some of the problems with reporting one's own personality traits, such as through the MMPI, through the Big Five, is faking. Test takers intentionally give misleading information, fake good, fake bad. Test makers both safeguard to reduce faking. MMPI halves contain scales designed to detect faking. So that's why MMPI is really good, because it has thought about all the scenarios and has ensured that that is added to the list. Carelessness and sabotage is also one of the other apprehensions when it comes to self-report inventories. Participants can get bored with long tests and select responses randomly. Test takers sometimes report incorrect information to sabotage a research project. Instruction, explanation, surveillance, and stressing the importance of the test can reduce the problem. Response tendencies could be social desirability, extent to which people present themselves in a favorable light. So they could present themselves in a way that they think is favorable. Acquiescence response can be a problem on some scales. people's tendency to agree with the test items can distort the meaning of scores. So next, we're going to look at the strengths and criticisms of the trait approach. There are many strengths, as we have studied on the other lenses of personality as well. Trait approach also has several of these. Usage of objective measures to examine the constructs is a bold strength of the trait approach. The reduced level of bias and subjectivity, numerous practical applications like the ones we just highlighted. Educational psychologists and employers use trait measures in their work, and it generates large amount of research. The criticisms are that no explanations on how traits develop or how to help people who suffer from extreme scores. No schools of psychotherapy have originated from the trait approach. So, for instance, how we have existential school of thought, we have the psychoanalytic. We don't have something known as the trait school of thought. So, it's a lack of an agreed upon framework as well. So, here are some summary slides for you to go through. And with that, we conclude this lovely presentation. If you have any questions, do reach out, and all the best.